Aloha and welcome to this presentation of the Vegan Society of Hawaii. Today, we're delighted and honored to have with us a longtime friend of VSH, T. Colin Campbell, PhD. Dr. Campbell has been dedicated to the science of human health for 66 years. His best-selling books include as co-author the huge international bestseller, The China Study, Startling Implications for Diet, Weight Loss, and Long-Term Health, as well as the New York Times bestseller Whole, The Low-Carb Fraud, and most recently, The Future of Nutrition. An insider's look at the science, why we keep getting it wrong, and how to start getting it right. I'd like to give a warm welcome now to Dr. T. Colin Campbell. Aloha.
Thank you very much, Lorraine, for that very kind invitation, and Dr. Bruce Heydrich. Why is nutrition so confusing for so many? And when I basically asked that question, or been asked that question many times, I'm referring to the confusion held by the public as well as by professionals. It works both ways. And for me to best explain what I learned through these 66 years, I got to bring in first a little of my personal background, because it was very germane to my journey in this field. First off, I did my doctoral dissertation at Cornell University, as you can see, quite a number of years ago, on promoting the consumption of more animal protein. Promoting the consumption of more animal protein. And that was consistent with my personal background, being raised on a farm, especially a dairy farm. So more protein, I mean, everybody believed that. I believed everybody else did. That is animal protein. Then in my first academic position at Virginia Tech University, I was asked to coordinate a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children that was supported by the US State Department. And there we were expected to come up with some ideas. And in the area of nutrition, the general idea was that malnourished children around the world not only were lacking calories, enough food to eat, but also they were lacking sufficient protein, especially animal protein. So there you had it, a personal background, just automatically assuming animal protein is the best thing going. Secondly, doing my doctoral dissertation on animal protein. And thirdly, in this position in the Philippines, sort of expected to recommend the consumption of more animal protein. What happened at that time was I got some evidence that suggested that the children getting the most protein were more likely to get liver cancer. That was a bit puzzling, but shocking. And then there was this study in India that came out in 1968 on the same question. In a sense, they believe that when liver cancer is produced, and it's very common actually in Asia and Africa, it's the fourth leading cause of death in the world. So this is a serious cancer. But in any case, there's the Indian workers here, Mahadev and Gopalan, wanted to test the idea that maybe cancer could be prevented by increasing protein consumption. And that was animal protein, by the way. So they did this animal study, and what they learned here was exactly the opposite, what they thought they might see. The animals getting more than, getting higher levels of protein, animal protein, as I say, I emphasize, 100% got the cancers. And these animals had been exposed to a carcinogen that causes liver cancer. In contrast, animals given 5%, none did. I mean, it could not have been more opposite than what they expected. And they, quite frankly, hardly believed their own work. But that was basically consistent with what I thought I was hearing and seeing with the children. So that required, from my going back to my laboratory at Virginia Tech, set up a research program that was actually funded for, close to 40 years thereafter. Research program with funding from the NIH to see first, is it true that animal protein increases cancer? I mean, I didn't believe that. Animal protein increasing liver cancer in this case. So there were lots of studies that were done over the next years. I had access to a lot of graduate students working for me, doing doctoral dissertations of their own. And so I want to show you here one particular display of the results that we got that really turned my head, I have to tell you. This is cancer growth in the first 12 weeks after being exposed to a carcinogen that causes a mutation. That's the start starting place for cancer, basically. And then so over the first 12 weeks, I wanted to see what would happen if we fed two different levels of protein, like the Indian workers did. So you can see your 20% of total calories as animal protein here, and the animal protein was a protein of cow's milk. These cancers are growing well. The animals given 5%, they did not. That's exactly the same as what we saw in the Indian work. Then we tried something else that was really kind of exciting, and I wanted to see what would happen if we changed the diet during those 12 weeks. When we fed 20% for the first 3 weeks, the cancers are growing quite well. If we switched it to 5, we turned the cancer off, back on, off. I mean, this is really dramatic. It suggested that instead of cancer depending only on genes, we can control cancer by nutritional means. In this case, with animal protein, just turning it and turning it off. I mean, I have to say, at this point in time, my own bias and going into this program really started being questioned, and I had to take this seriously, that animal proteins could cause cancer. It also suggested another big idea, namely that nutrition, not genes, mutated genes, I might say, nutrition controls cancer development. I mean, there's other nutrients that show them to do this, etc. I mean, this is a really big ticket idea, even today, that almost no one recognizes. It's not our genetic background and genes only that causes cancer. It may put us in a position to be more susceptible, but it's really the nutrition that does that. So then the next thing I think I should bring to your attention is the fact that instead of casein, we decided to try a couple of plant proteins, soy and wheat. And it turned out these plant proteins did not increase this early cancer development, even when it was fed at a high level. I mean, again, it's just pretty remarkable, pretty convincing. Increasing cancer was a product of consuming animal protein, period. Plant protein did not do it. This, in turn, in addition to hundreds of other studies, I should say, led to me to suspect another question that should be answered. Namely, animal proteins can cause cancer, and I'll show you the evidence for that in a moment in humans. Animal proteins can not only cause cancer, but what about other diseases like heart disease and diabetes and so forth? And then secondly, if animal proteins are able to control cancer, what about plant proteins? That's the same as we're looking at experimental animals. Now, before going to this level, I do want to tell you this is something that in research, we are absolutely have to do, especially on an observation like this. I mean, to say that animal protein causes cancer is very provocative, I'm sure you recognize, and hardly believable. I mean, I was warned by my colleagues, don't go down this road because no one's going to believe you. The only way that argument could be countered was to find out what is the mechanism that explains this effect. That is foundational for research of this kind. If we see something odd, we want to know how it works. So we started looking for mechanisms. And if in fact we could find a mechanism that would lend itself to, let's say, drug intervention, what I'm talking about in this case, and I'll come back to this in a moment, if the animal protein is doing this nasty stuff, and if we find out what the mechanism is, then we can come up with a drug maybe to block it, keep on eating our animal protein. So what I want to show you here, we put the kibosh to that idea. Here's a schematic of how cancer is expected to form experimentally. 3 stages. Starts out with initiation, that's when the mutation is there. Secondly, after the normal cell has been mutated into a cancer cell, at that point in time, that keeps on growing and dividing over time. Pretty soon you got a tumor, and so it goes. In the case of humans, now the cancer finally reaches the stage, maybe over months or even years. It finally reaches a stage where someone realizes they have a problem, they get diagnosed with it. That's the last stage, is called progression. And what is typical about that idea is that these cancer cells in an original site in the body have migrated to elsewhere. They've metastasized, that's the word we use. And you'll show here too that this cancer is only going forward. In other words, the entire explanation for cancer rests on the idea whether or not we have the genes to cause the cancer. It's that simple. Damaged genes, I should say. I'll just go in one direction. So we look for the mechanism, maybe in this first stage. we wanted to find out in this first stage, can we identify a mechanism, a biochemical mechanism? The first thing we learned, and usually this involved a doctoral dissertation on the part of a student working 3 or 4 years at least to do it. Very complicated stuff. High protein diet, first off, we saw it increases the rate of entry of carcinogens into the cell. Oh, there's the answer. If we just do something block that, then we're home free. But that was only one reaction. I had another student who was looking for studies to do too. So we looked at another phase of this carcinogenesis process. What we found was that the high animal protein increases the activity of a very important enzyme that then activates the carcinogen to produce a product that binds to genes, okay? So this is called mixed function oxidase. The high protein diet increased the synthesis of that enzyme, which made it more active, producing more. The high protein diet in the first case here, it increased the rate of the cell. Secondly, it increased the enzyme activity, I should say, just by increasing synthesis. It also did something else that altered the structure of this complex enzyme in a way in which it produced things faster. So 2 ways for that enzyme to be activated, and that in turn then produces a product that binds to genes, which in turn, that was a next one had a separate study, we increased the amount of the carcinogen coming into the cell. We increased the amount that was actually bound to the DNA. That's the start of a mutation. And this happens in microseconds, by the way, very fast. It increases the damaged DNA, if you will. But in normal circumstances for us humans, in any place, any other species, basically, we have mechanisms, fail-safe mechanisms to work as well as it can to protect us. And so if on occasion, maybe every millionth occasion of cell dividing, if we get a new cancer cell, damaged DNA, then we have something in our body called DNA repair. That's another mechanism. What was happening, the high protein diet increased all these things, not just 1 or 4 things here. And then it turned around, it decreased the one thing that should be increased. So it increased these, it decreased the good stuff we have. And then I turned my attention to the second phase, promotion. From that slide I just showed you can see cancer is reversible during this stage. So we looked for a mechanism again, and I won't go into the details here. But what it basically we learned again, there's another 5 mechanisms that were changed. 4 of them were all increased, and when they're increased, they just naturally increase the rate of cancer. They increase the rate at which cancer cells divide. They increase the production of what was called oxygen-free radicals, very dangerous stuff. Increase the hormone and so forth and so on. And in summary, what we saw was this. The high protein diet increased 8 of these mechanisms, all of which promote cancer, right? It's really important, increased it. And the high protein diet in turn decreased 2 cancer inhibiting mechanisms. Wow, that was really pretty incredible. No exceptions, by the way. This was done over a period, as I say, 12 to 15 years. At the end of this period of time, I sort of asked myself, wait a minute, I'm looking for the mechanism, that accounts for this effect, and I'm seeing 10 of them. And I knew at that time, there's not only 10, there's hundreds, there's thousands of mechanisms. I'll come back to that point later. But what was interesting, we looked at 10 mechanisms, every single one changed in a direction that increases cancer, all working together, 10 of 10, working in unison to create. That's pretty incredible, actually. And it's led to this idea. I couldn't identify which mechanism, which one of those is. In other words, if we get some kind of drug to inhibit that mechanism, what about all the others? I'll come back to that point in a bit. So this idea of finding a drug to treat this condition, it's really doesn't make a lot of sense. This basically established what we call biological plausibility, namely it proved beyond a shadow of doubt that animal protein for this particular cancer, animal protein increases cancer, period. That's it. No one will ever show anything opposite when you see something like this. And it happens very, very fast within, you could say seconds, minutes, whatever, certainly over 2 or 3 days, you can see the effect. So that's what it did. I want to tell you one more thing about this observation. As I say, what this showed was that there is no such thing as a single mechanism. That is what should I say? That's almost world-shaking idea, because all of us in nutrition, and especially doctors and others, they think that the cause of something is caused by one thing, and one thing operates on one mechanism to produce a disease. That couldn't be further from the truth. Nutrition is a function of not just one nutrient doing its business, but a whole lot of nutrients all working together. Each one has got a whole bunch of mechanisms. I mean, we can easily get into thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of mechanisms that are operating in a system like this. It gives a new definition for nutrition, very different definition. Nutrition is not about one nutrient. So now here's another way to look at this question. This was done, I did this about 10 years ago or so. I just wanted to go back to see if in the previous literature in my field, in cancer research and nutrition research, I wanted to see if anybody had in years past published anything concerning the relationship between animal protein intake and cancer in humans. Here I found this paper here, published in the early 1970s. It's on kidney cancer, the incidence of kidney cancer. What they showed for a group of countries, right here, increasing animal protein intake in these countries gives a rise to a higher risk of kidney cancer. Wow. They didn't put that red line there, but I, using an algorithm I'm familiar with, I was able to show here that there's a straight line relationship. What it shows is as soon as animal protein exceeds that level, or even from zero, if you will, as soon as you start putting animal protein in the diet, the risk of kidney cancer is going up. Here's another one, heart disease. This is a study done in 1959, by the way. This researcher here was looking, he actually dared to put on this chart what's percent animal protein. This is a screenshot, so I'm not making these numbers up. This is what they published. And again, this is a group of countries. The numbers were identified in the text, but as animal protein intake is increased along the x-axis, then the amount of deaths from heart disease increases, okay? Again, a straight line relationship, just like the other. That's pretty amazing. Here's one for more recently in the 1980s, actually, from someone I know who looked at the relationship between prostate cancer and skim milk or non-fat milk. Something very familiar to me, being raised on a dairy farm, but it was called skim milk. Skim milk or non-fat milk is a drink, if you will, if I can call it that. It's a drink that doesn't have fat in it. That's number one. And secondly, it doesn't really have any sugar in it. Milk doesn't have sugar. And the third thing is the only thing left is protein, animal protein. Look at the relationship between non-fat milk and prostate cancer. Wow. Again, see the same thing. Coming right down near the XY origin. Come back to that in a moment. Here's one from breast cancer, 1980s, by a friend from Canada that I knew. He was surveying in the 1970s the relationship between diet and breast cancer for different countries. Here's the US up here, pretty high. What he did all this here, and he found that saturated fat was related to more breast cancer. Now, it turns out saturated fat is really not very reactive. And later years, it could not really account for that. What this saturated fat is accounting for is animal protein, because saturated fat is mostly found in animal food, not in plant food. So this is a reflection, again, of increasing protein intake, animal protein intake, if you will, giving more breast cancer. Let's look at some more. It goes on and on. Here's one that shows for heart disease intake, the relationship of heart disease, now on the x-axis here, with an intake of cholesterol. Cholesterol only is in animal food. From this chart, you say, oh, as you increase cholesterol, you will have more heart disease. And that's the way a lot of researchers thought for 100 years, quite frankly. That's not true. The amount of cholesterol we consume doesn't have that much effect on cancer, quite frankly. It's not the cholesterol in the food that makes a difference. It's a cholesterol in the blood. But anyhow, this is what they conclude. Cholesterol, let's cut down cholesterol intake. You know, it's good for not consuming animal food, but it's not due to cholesterol. That's a thought, incidentally, still that 90% of the people in this field don't seem to understand. Here's one that shows another study showing increase in meat consumption, increase in colon cancer. Wow, look at that one. Right down near, here's one for uterine cancer. In this case, it's total fat, which is correlated with animal protein consumption in different countries. So all these, there's 7 studies there, 7 studies, a lot of work. What it shows is that when people consume more animal protein-based foods, they're going to have all these different kinds of cancers and more stuff too. It's really pretty remarkable. Here's my conclusion from this comparison of these studies. In all these studies, the things that where they're looking at like skim milk, or they'll talk about meat or total fat or etc., whatever. I call these surrogates for animal protein. In other words, it's animal protein that really is the question here. And these surrogate things like cholesterol, meat, total fat, you can see there, okay? And finally, here's one, and there's some more of these, but I'm just listing here. I was able to get my hands on them real quick. On the breast cancer one, you'll recall that when you increase saturated fat, which comes from animal foods, right, you see a straight line relationship. In this case, what they did, they showed that if you increase plant food, plant protein in this case, or unsaturated fat, as you increase that, there's no effect on, it's just kind of a random thing. Plant foods are not doing this. It's animal foods. That's the same thing we saw in the laboratory in probably 100 different ways. We had two kinds of data that will never be refuted. And I have to really emphasize that to all my colleagues who might want to think otherwise. Animal food increases cancer, heart disease, all kinds of cancers when we start consuming that, period. That's it. And so it's time to, in a way, stop arguing about that point. It does it. In order to get rid of, not get cancer in the first place and heart disease and some others, don't eat the animal food. Okay, so that in turn, that all that complexity, I mean, the biochemistry is very complex, and sometimes it's, of course, very hard to explain that to the public. And I should say doctors too, because they never had any nutrition, so they don't really know either. I've been interested in reducing that complexity down to something simple so we can all understand. Namely, I think these two ideas here, this is what I'm proposing. I think these two ideas pretty much capture the whole, all that tremendous complexity and gets out of the field of confusion as to why we haven't heard it before. Just consume plants. That's all I need to do. Consume plants. We get a whole lot of variety of plants, of course, vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, legumes, and nuts, and so forth. Consume them, but not animals. Cut out the animal foods. Just come back to plants, okay? The second thing is something I want to now talk about a little bit. Consume the plants in a whole food form. Don't take the nutrients out of the plant and hope you're going to get something good out of it. Try to consume the food on a whole food form, more or less about the same time, because Mother Nature, when she's working out what's going to happen to this food in her intestines, she wants to have access to all the goodies and decide what to do with each nutrient, of which there are hundreds of thousands, if you will. So let's consume that whole food, so she knows, you know, what thing to take and do whatever she wants to do with it. And so all the nutrients. We can cook food, we can slice and dice the food, and all that stuff. That doesn't really make any difference. So here's a relationship, a fundamental relationship in human health, human nutrition, if you will. As we increase animal food as a proportion of our diet, as we increase animal food and get in trouble, according to these data here, we at the same time are decreasing plant food. And that's where all the goodies are. Plant food has got antioxidants and complex carbohydrates and minerals and vitamins and so forth. So we get two things working on us. As animal food goes up, that causes problems. But by decreasing plant food, that causes problems too. So when we see those straight line relationships there, that's really a function of two things working. But animal food is driving it because, in large measure, because most people through the ages have wanted to consume animal protein because they think it's good. That's their main reason, and also justification for them eating animals. So keep that in mind for the moment. I want to go now back just a little bit, asking a question. There's a huge literature on this question here, and I found it fascinating. Namely, this guy, Gerhard Müller, was a Danish chemist working back in the 1800s. In 1839, nutrition was hardly invented then, but as a word, but protein was revered. They didn't know it, but meat, I should say, meat was revered. And that goes all the way back to biblical days when it was said in there, in the verses that, you know, meat is fine. It was even encouraged, I should tell you. I found that surprising. But anyhow, the idea of consuming meat and consuming animals is a very old idea. So it's 1839. So he's working with a dog, and he found out the dog needed some meat to survive. Took the meat away, didn't give it to him. The dog, you know, had trouble. So he said, "What's in the meat?" So he's a chemist. He sort of worked on it. He found a chemical in there, a chemical. He didn't know what it was, but he found it, he could isolate it, and he didn't never give it a name. He named after the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. So here's an old, probably ancient idea on the belief of many people that animals are here on the earth for us to eat. And finally, this chemist came along and brilliantly discovered what the chemical name that accounted for that effect. So he called it protein, after the Greek word proteos. Why did they do that? I mean, why did they create that idea that eating animals is a good deal? One of the reasons they said animal protein is said to have high quality. And that was proved, so to speak, I'll put in quotes, was proved by a guy named H.H. Mitchell at the University of Illinois in 1924. He developed a method to figure out why is animal protein better than plant protein in terms of increasing weight gain, body weight gain. Body weight gain is good for animal production. That makes sense. That is sort of surmised by humans that, yeah, we want to grow faster too. That's not a very good idea. Growing a little more slowly by consuming a plant diet is good. That's healthy. This established in the scientific community this idea that all the animal proteins were called high quality because more of the protein being consumed is retained for body weight. And I said, oh, wow, this is what makes animal protein better than plant protein, increases gain in body weight. There was another thing here, there's a sidebar story. This guy here was participating in a conversation in 1913 about the fact that animal protein is so important. It is so important. It's a matter of racial superiority, believe it or not. He was suggesting, in fact, with some others participating in this conversation, that animal protein was so important because if they don't get it, that indicated racial inferiority. Quite an extraordinary stretch of the imagination. High quality means of the proportion being consumed, more of it is retained in the body. We also call this biological value. I have to tell you, too, that concept biological value was in part the basis for my own thesis in the 1950s. It was still part of everybody's conversation. Animal food has higher biological value and therefore higher quality. Everybody wants quality, right? That's one of the reasons, whether it's subconscious or unconscious or whatever, we consume animal proteins because we believe it has higher quality. Plant proteins didn't do that quite the same way. No, it's called low quality. This really feeding into the public narrative about, hey, it's really important. We got to eat animals because we got to eat animal protein. Just to make a long story short, we do not need any animal protein to satisfy our protein requirements. Plants, whatever mix you want, they have enough plant protein and it's better protein at that. So I just wanted to discount that. By the way, this is something that came from my own research over the years. The high quality animal protein also increases in some other ways. You showed this mechanism before. It increases growth hormone. Wow, that increases cancer. It increases estrogen in females. That increases breast cancer, a bunch of other things. Increases its free radicals, increases mutations, and it decreased one of those two things called natural killer cells. Natural killer cells is now called T cells. That's what all the people during the pandemic, researchers are trying to figure out how to get T cells back up again with some kind of drug. They do not know they can get that back up by stop eating animal protein. The same thing with DNA repair. So all these things here working together, they increase cancer. So higher protein retention, which is quote unquote quality, high quality, it's high quality for increasing body weight, but it also is high quality for increasing cancer. But a whole bunch of different things. It increases blood cholesterol too. That's generally been swept under the rug. An increase in blood cholesterol, which indeed in turn increases heart disease. This was discovered in 1909 by a Russian scientist at that time and proven essentially by 1924. High animal protein increases blood sugar, A1C. And if you're familiar with diabetes, you'll know that. And that increases diabetes. And so one way you can sort of solve diabetes is take them off an animal food. It's just plant food. It's more sugar, yeah, that they try to fool you and tell you that you shouldn't have that sugar. That's wrong. Because if you take a diet of just plants, the sugar drops rapidly and diabetics go off their medications. These are just a few highlights of I could do 100 or 200 more observations like this. I come down with this definition here. Holistic nutrition is comprised of, and I'd like to call the word holist, with the W in it. If you just leave it like holist, that word's been around. The W is not in the Oxford or the other dictionaries. And so I put the W there myself. But what I want to emphasize, nutrition is not about individual nutrients, which almost everyone assumes is true. It's about all of them work together, holistic. And so real nutrition, like in a whole food plant-based diet, multiple nutrients, multiple mechanisms, multiple diseases, multiple health improvements. There you have it. I suggest, for example, if we recognize this and sort of come to really understand the science, and this is what it's about, we talk about a plant-based diet. I'm actually the one that developed those words, plant-based, back in the late 1970s. I was on a cancer committee at that time for the government, and we were charged with determining priorities for applications for cancer research funding. On that committee, there were about 13 of us, 14 of us, I guess. We had this important job of determining who gets funding, who doesn't for the government. And we were looking at applications, reviewing them to determine priorities. The other members of the committee were cancer researchers, oncologists, geneticists. At that time, this is late 1970s, we started to see some applications where researchers were kind of interested in looking at the effect of diet and cancer. And so they asked me to take some time at the next meeting and go through and explain something about nutrition. And I didn't want to call it vegetarian. I don't mean to question the motivation for vegetarianism, but I did not get here because of vegetarianism or veganism. I didn't even know it at that time. So I didn't want to use that word because that word has been around for 150 years. I would argue it's not been terribly successful in getting the larger population to buy into it. So I wanted to come up with a term that's more relevant to science. And I called it plant-based. Words just kind of hung around. It's just only been the last 10 years or so I now suddenly see it's emerging in the popular press and all that sort of stuff. Taken a while, but it's really working its magic because when you talk about a plant-based diet, this is becoming central to industry and government and everything else. So there's one more part of my message here, as I mentioned before, so we should consume a plant-based diet. The other is to consume it in the whole food form. Let's have a look at that. I want to spend a little bit of time with you trying to tell you why the whole idea, where it comes from. And I got to go back, but forgive me a little bit here, a little bit of biochemistry. This is what I taught at the beginning of my career, actually. It turns out that we get energy from the sun. We all know that. And the energy that is then captured by plants in a process called photosynthesis, the energy is captured, and then it's used to make bonds, chemical bonds between atoms, if you will, resulting in the formation of something like glucose. So the energy from the sun here is packed in this chemical, glucose. At that point in time, we consume it in the form of starch and carbohydrate. We consume it, and then it gets broken down in the cells. And by the way, we got about 37 trillion cells. So this is a big game, actually. So we break it down, and it's all being broken down finally through this so-called Krebs cycle. You may have heard of that. By step, the body, the cells are actually extracting from those, and that energy-dense product is extracting, as I say, a step-by-step process, extracting the energy out and packing it into a new product. So I just call this here extraction of chemical energy, reaction by reaction. So that's the process of energy metabolism in a sense. Okay, that was in the 60s. About 10 years later, it was a simple scheme in those days. All of a sudden, this really kind of took off. Everybody's in science is discovering all kinds of new enemies and new reactions. And in about the 1970s, this appeared. See, it's really getting complicated. All these reactions here, the one I just told you about, is just a little bit of streak right there, but you got all these other things. And in fact, now this is at least 1,000 times larger. It's so complex, it's beyond comprehension. Here's a way scientists look at the question concerning what to do about disease. They see this, and so then they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what is the mechanism, just like I did. I'm one of the guilty ones too. We tried to look at what is the mechanism that needs to be knocked out or controlled, if you will, for whatever. And so they come up with a chemical. This is the basis of the entire drug industry, the entire pharmaceutical industry. They want to solve problems by finding the mechanism, right? When there is no mechanism, first off. You want to find a mechanism, find a chemical, hit that one reaction, but to get side effects. All drugs have side effects. Is that a good idea? Is that a good idea? I don't think so. Because the food protocol, nutrition protocol, it basically involves multiple nutrients and infinite numbers of reactions, all working together like a symphony. They basically it has all these here, a million more reactions. That's under the code. Somebody's controlling that to give the benefits that we see. That's the reason why we get a decrease in cancer and heart disease and diabetes and all the rest of it, with one kind of food. No side effects. Look at the difference between the drug protocol and the food protocol. One reaction, multiple side effects. Here's multiple nutrients, no side effects, actually the opposite. Let me show you one example of how this here is, how we've been duped into believing in this stuff. Here's my scheme again. And at that time, it was learned, and this is the 1980s, by the way. At that time, it was learned that the amount of cholesterol we have in our serum or bloodstream was related to heart disease. Higher cholesterol, higher heart disease, right? And it was becoming fairly commonly known. And so the thought was, well, gosh, if we could find out how the cholesterol in our body is synthesized, the amount of blood, by the way, is mostly from the body that our body's making it. Cholesterol is an important compound, but it's also associated when it's high with heart disease. They want to learn, biochemically, where's this come from? How do we make it? Well, it turns out in this scheme of things here, it starts with this compound here, and this goes through a series of reactions, A, B, C, D, on down. Finally, you get the simple little compound here, creating this rather complex serum cholesterol molecule. So here's the thought. If this is associated with heart disease, which they were convinced it was, let's find a way to block it. Let's find a way to block it. So they found something. There was one reaction in there that looked for that one mechanism, and they blocked it. They said, this is good. Now we're going to control heart disease. That's statins. The statin industry was born in order to try to reduce the risk of heart attack. It turns out, when the latest research is showing, it really is having virtually no effect or very minimal effect on reducing heart disease. They really don't work. It's about as I understand it, worldwide, it's an $85 billion industry. So they had a good time making a lot of money. You're selling statins. But in any case, it doesn't work like they claim it does. It reduces cholesterol, sure. It slows this down here. It does that and presses them, and they say, oh, heart disease is going to be lower. But that's not really quite true. On the other hand, the whole food plant-based diet, as I said before, all plants, whole food, it controls this cholesterol and heart disease, therefore, with no side effects. So statins, this idea of consuming this kind of diet beats any day, hands down, the use of statins. If we do this, we don't need that. And there's a lot of side effects of statins, as many of you may know. What I mean to say about that right there is that one chemical, one reaction is being used to describe the whole. Here's another example that's pretty impressive. This is published in 1981, and it was by a group of researchers who were interested in smoking and lung cancer. People smoking a lot, they get more lung cancer. But there was another thing here, let me mention it in just a moment. So the first thing I want to show you is that these are 30-year smokers. Here are people smoking less than 30 years. That's just an arbitrary number, but they're the lighter smokers. Here's the heavy smokers. It turns out they measured something else in this study. They mentioned the amount of carotene that's being consumed. Now, carotene is a vitamin. It's from plants, only from plants. It's from things like spinach and Swiss chard and, the plants basically. So they measured the carotene being consumed. I don't know who came up with that idea, but that's what they did. And so among these heavy smokers, they divided them 4 groups, and they took information on how much carotene they're consuming. Look what they found. This is amazing. From very low levels of carotene to much higher levels. It turns out those consuming not much in the way of plants, this is an indication of plants. Those who have very low plant intake, they got to lung cancer. And almost like a straight line relationship. That's what we call dose response relationship. That is really convincing. In other words, the people consuming the most plants that's beta carotene. Most plants, they almost did not get lung cancer, even though they had been smoking cigarettes for 30 years or more. By the way, I'm not in any way suggesting that they should have concluded it's okay to smoke and just get your beta carotene, just eat the plants. I don't want to say that because there's other things too that go on here, but this is what was shown. Carotene only comes from plants, right? Okay. So what they wanted to do is say, oh, this beta carotene is pretty good. This sounds pretty good to us. Let's take a pharmacological approach and control lung cancer in smokers. So they wanted to test the idea. This is a group of Norwegian American scientists. They gathered together 39,000 male smokers, pretty heavy smokers, have a high risk of getting lung cancer. That's a lot of smokers, if you will. And they were going to follow them for 8 years to see what effect beta carotene might have. They wanted to take the beta carotene out and put in a pill. That's what they wanted to do. They thought this might be a good way. If all these smokers just had beta carotene, they wouldn't get lung cancer. So they did the study. Here's what they found. In the study, they were, of course, measuring during that time. They were measuring the amount of beta carotene being decreased in the food, right? What they found was the same thing as the last study. People consuming more beta carotene, they had a lower risk of lung cancer, almost 20% lower. In 5 years' time, that's a big, big effect. In 5 years' time, they really had reduced lung cancer incidence or deaths actually by almost 20%. And it was statistically significant. Now the next question is, what happened to people taking beta carotene? Okay, those folks taking beta carotene to supposedly decrease the cancer, actually it increased lung cancer statistically significant, also just about almost 20%. That was so remarkable. That in this 8 years that they planned for the study, they were so compelling, they had to quit the study. So they had to stop the study because otherwise, if they let people going on smoking and not tell them the results of this, that have been immoral. So they had to stop the study. Beta carotene. Now, what I want to say about this and looking back, it was important to my research at the time in terms of some of these questions. But what this shows is that even when people are exposed to toxic substances, such as tobacco smoke or other nasty stuff, this kind of nutrition actually tends to attenuate those toxicities, as it did here with smoking. Quite remarkable. So it's another point to make about whole food plant-based diet. It slows down heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and all that, but it also tends to protect us against noxious chemicals. I don't advocate being around noxious chemicals, but obviously, but I just wanted to point it out as indicate how strong this was. So now I want to shift the scene here a little bit and bring to your attention a study we did in China with my Chinese colleagues, my British colleagues. In this case here, it was an 8,900 adults, a big study. We did it because in China, they had established in the 1970s that cancer was very high in certain regions of the country and very low in others. It was more or less true for about a dozen different cancers. So cancer were concentrated in certain areas. I became aware of that. And then the first Chinese scientists that come to the United States after we started talking to each other, two countries talking to each other, after they came to my lab, spent some time there, I was suggesting, why don't we do a joint study between the United States and China to go there to see if in a population there, we might be able to learn something about the causes of cancer, all these different cancers. Later, it turned out heart disease and a bunch of other diseases too. So we organized the study as a collaborative study. This is, let's say, the first research project between our two countries. We did that in 1984, actually. That was a China study that most people know about. We repeated it a second time when I got my friends in Taiwan and mainland China to agree to do it again. It was a nice project. They couldn't talk to each other. They couldn't go to each other's areas. So I went back and forth between the two and carried the message. And finally, they agreed to join and did a study the second time, 1989. That was the biggest group of studies. Oh, the first study was 6,500. This is 8,900. It was a big study. So I had access to this data. And when the pandemic came out in early 2020, 2.5 years ago, I knew something about the data we had from China that I thought was worth publishing. We had data from China that cancer caused by hepatitis B virus, we had data to suggest that nutrition had a big effect on this virus and its production of liver cancer. I got the data out, and here's what we found. Now, this is a very serious virus. This causes us about 800,000 deaths a year. And I want to just here to show you what happens to a virus. I'm sure you all know this. We get infected with the virus, like the coronavirus. It comes and lands on us. And we can detect the presence of that virus in the form of its protein, if you will, called antigen. That now we're testing positive for the virus. That doesn't really mean anything. It's just to say, well, wait a minute, let's look around. That virus in our body at that point in time can go in one of two directions. Either it can go on, in this case, to form liver cancer. If the virus, if it's not inactivated, we can't deal with it, it causes liver cancer. And as I say, about 800,000 people a year die in that world. Oh, and it turns out in the data we have that for those individuals consuming animal food with the virus, and it only was like 10% of what we do in the West, a very low amount of animal food, they actually were the ones that got the liver cancer. The animal food was so prominent, causing the virus to be activated, causing liver cancer. And animal food stood in the way of antibodies forming. So people get the virus, they test positive, well, they're wondering what they're going to do. And if they've eaten some animal food, the risk of getting liver cancer is far higher than the others consuming plant food. So plant food, the people consuming more plant food, they were able to form antibodies and T cells, the two different characteristics of immunity. So when, as I say, we measured this way back in 1989 and 1990, or 30 years ago. People consuming plant food, their virus, when they got the virus, it was inactivated very quickly. And they didn't suffer the consequences, certainly not the serious consequences of the virus. People consuming animal food, they're the ones that died. So I decided to write a paper on this, at the beginning of the pandemic, because I thought, what happens to one virus and by way of nutrition is very highly, highly likely to be the same for another virus, maybe to different degrees. But anyhow, I wrote a paper and I put in the title suggesting that this might relate to COVID-19. That is one way. That here's an opportunity to inform people about this virus. Eat the right food, and you'll be in a lot better shape. By the way, the data we got in this case here was highly, highly significant. This information here is some of the most significant data I've ever seen, certainly of the hundreds of studies that I've done. It was really incredible. Nutrition protected against the harm of the virus. And I suggested that maybe this could have something to do with corona, as I say, with COVID-19. I sent it to two leading journals in science. I published in both of them before, in past years. And something happened that I'd never seen before in my life. They wouldn't even review it. They would not send it out for professional review. They just blocked it. My story that we can deal with this virus, one of the ways to deal with the virus, eat the right food. Eat the right food, a whole food plant-based diet. Either even late, just when you get infected, in fact, even at that point, it's not too late, or before, it's really quite remarkable. After that, there's the paper. I did eventually publish in a European journal, European Union. They took it, got published about that time. But the point I want to make here is that the system we now have in medicine at many different levels is now, in my view, unfortunately, very corrupted. And it's basically owned by publishing houses that determine what gets published and what doesn't. I'm really distressed about this because, science is a beautiful sort of system to think about how to work things out. Now, unfortunately, during the past few years, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Here's what happens here in the case of COVID-19. I suggest usually people over 60 years of age are the ones that are most likely to get it. And the ones who are getting into cancer and dying and suffering the consequences, they have comorbidity conditions. They've got diabetes, they've got obesity, heart disease, cancer, whatever. They're already at risk for the consequences of, because of poor nutrition. They're at risk. They get infected. They're the ones that suffer the COVID disease severity. So whole food plant-based diet obviously blocks this, heart disease, cancer, diabetes. That's one thing it does. We know that really well. And therefore, it also, in the hand that what we did in our studies, and I didn't get a chance to show you, it also blocks, if it's the same bad nutrition, it also blocks the severity of the disease. That was my suggestion. And of course, they didn't want to hear that. They had those folks that are doing that had an interest in selling something, I think. You could guess what. After I came out with this paper, there was another paper that came out, just a very kind of superficial paper, kind of weak to detect anything. They're simply asking questions just out of France. They're asking people who are plant-based or eat, consuming pescatarian diets, what were their likelihood of their getting COVID-19 severity in cases. It was actually, even though that was a weak study, they still showed a 73% decrease among people who are plant-based and pescatarian. And then there were a couple more that's even higher, like 80%. These are these studies here. They don't want to hear that. So let me finish off then at this point in time. Tell you something that I think is really, really fundamental. We have medicine. We have medicine that is all was based on drugs. We have a philosophy in medicine to treat sick people, assuming we're going to look at one disease at a time or one cause, one mechanism. That's the way we think. That's called reductionism, just one thing at a time. And eventually we want to find one drug to treat whatever disease it is we have the problem. So the one drug, now that we call it targeted drug therapy, side effects, this is the system we're living in, all of us. This is why holistic nutrition is not taught in a single medical school in the United States. That may surprise some of you. It's not taught in a medical school in the United States. It's I should say, I'm really disgusted that we've lived so long. And so physicians don't get trained in nutrition, period. Now you can imagine what that does to the public at large. So you ask the question, why are they so confused? Well, of course they're confused. The public doesn't get access to this. We don't know what we don't know. Why should we know? And I can say this with some conviction because I was one of them. I was in the same society as all of you folks and everybody else. I didn't come into this because of a preconceived ethical arguments or anything else. I wanted to talk about the science that I was learning, and that's why I gave the name plant-based and whole food plant-based. If nutrition were taught in medical schools, we'd need less drugs. This is why we're so confused. Will the present medical system ever allow this? No, it won't. No, it won't. There's one more thing added to this layer, and this comes from policy. And I spent about 20 intensive years at a fairly high level in the government, working with agencies that determine policy. We've got two major departments in our government. One is called USDA. Let's call it Big Ag. They're basically a livestock-based industry. Let's face it, livestock. The other is called Health and Human Services. NIH is in that, and FDA, and all these others. And that some people have called it big pharma because they depend on the use of drugs. So what do we have? And actually, I mean, the people doing this, they don't know. So I don't want to question their ethics, quite frankly. It's a system we've just come to live with that we can learn about, either through doing the science and or sort of go back and look in history. This department here, agriculture, we pay money. Our taxes support it. That money is used to subsidize the production of the wrong food. Meat, dairy, and eggs. That's the way it is. Very, very powerful. Makes us sick. Okay, more of us get sick. It's very clear. Life expectancy now in the United States is the lowest of any of the Western countries. Our life expectancy is actually declining with that kind of eating. So here we have it. Big Ag is doing its thing. So we get sick. Well, there's not much incentive, it seems like to me. Not that it's intentional. I don't like to say that at all. But we get sick, so we have to do something about it. So we use drugs. That's called big pharma. Big pharma practically owns health, and the company, the industry owns this agency of the U.S. Department. In effect, owns it. Big Ag owns USDA. So one department is keeping us sick. The other department is trying to make us well. It's all based on reductionist philosophy. A lot of this is dependent on, and this I'm saying this from a personal experience, sort of in a sense, almost paying a penalty. We used to have an industry in academia, tenure. You had to earn tenure. Young faculty members had to earn it, prove their worth. And then when you got tenure, you had freedom of speech. That is essential to any country that expects to get the truth. So in the United States, way back when I was a student, maybe 80, 90% of the faculty were getting tenure. They had a right to speak, and they couldn't be fired. They could be fired. But in 1980, things once started to go south. From 1980 to 2010, the percentage of faculty that had tenure declined from 70% to 30%. And those who had the full measure of the promotion was only like 10%. So academic tenure and freedom of speech is probably one of the most serious disasters in this country for the survival almost of our country. Because now people in academia, they got to be careful. They can't say things like I say. No, they get fired. They get fired. We need this here, and the public tend not to know this. We need tenure. We need freedom of speech. I was fortunate I got tenure when I was in my 30s, so I've had it about 55 years now. So I've been the benefactor of a good thing, and I know a thing gone wrong when the younger people are not able to get their tenure. I feel so sorry for the young people getting in with this excitement and this passion, for doing the right thing, and are not able to speak the truth to power. This all happened, even put in place in 2010. I told you about the survey, what from 1980 to 2010. In 2010, the Supreme Court came along and determined the so-called Citizens United case, where corporations could use their money to elect politicians. Since then, it's gone south completely. We elect officials, we elect politicians largely because of who has the money. And when we, in the case of academia, we've lost our academic freedom to a great extent. We've got a lot of problems in our country, but I would suggest for many people to think about this. This is probably one of the most serious. This can create war. There you have it. I would argue that this, and I think you would agree, this is the basis for what generally is called vegetarianism. But vegetarianism is get out of a shell, veganism, and actually think about this in a larger context than just the question concerning animal rights. That's fair. That's fair enough. I think it's a good motivation, but we need to think beyond that. We've got problems, we have environmental problems, human problems. I just had named some here, all these things here. We tend to treat each of these as separate entities to fix the loan, healthcare costs, all these things here, and lots more. You could think of more yourself. We tend to think of each of these as having independent causes. I'm saying no, it's one cause. But when you think of it, there's only one cause. We tend to overlook the possibility we got an umbrella effect. And there it is, whole food plant-based. If we consumed whole food plant-based nutrition, if those want to call it vegetarian, okay, but anyhow, I would call it whole food plant-based nutrition. We could conquer substantially all these environmental problems and these health problems all at one time. I have to say this is the premier issue of the day going forward if we want to survive in the world as a country.
Thank you very much, Dr. T. Colin Campbell, for your impressive presentation today, for showing us the results of your own studies as well as other studies, which broke so much ground in showing how a whole food plant-based diet can have such a profoundly positive effect on many of our most devastating, degenerative, yet common diseases. So from all of us, a big mahalo, Dr. Campbell.